like to go over some
You are
of the
joining your
questions that
conference
were
room.
asked
You are the
for
host.
the Priority Review
Access
Vouchers
is
program.
immediate. For a menu of
So question
available
one, how
prompts,
does
press
PRV
6
for
and the
drugs
pound
and
key.
vaccines differ? How does all the rules apply the same way for vaccines? So FDA does not have a preference for whether you are seeking a voucher for a drug application versus a vaccine application. If you meet all the requirements of the different PRV programs, then you're eligible for issuance of a PRV. The only distinction is that for vaccines, it's generally regulated by Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research. So if you need to connect with FDA, then there are different offices and divisions within CBER so that they can walk you through some of the requirements for PRV for vaccines. And of course, drugs are mainly regulated under CDER, so if you have interest in any of the drugs for PRV, then you will contact one of those appropriate review divisions responsible for the review of that drug product in CDER. Question 2, can you get a rare pediatric disease status if you do not pursue pediatric indication as your first marketing indication? So if you're talking about adding a rare pediatric disease indication to your currently approved application, then the answer is no, because one of the common requirements is that the drug does not, or the application does not have an active ingredient that's already approved. So you will not meet that requirement if you were to add a pediatric indication that's not your first marketing indication. Question 3, will the decision to renew the Rare Pediatric Disease PRV program be made before the sunset date? Are there any indications that suggest renewal or non-renewal? So unfortunately at this point, we don't have any information on whether the RPD PRV program will be renewed, but the RPD PRV statute does instruct the Government Accountability Office or Accounting Office to provide a study on how effective the RPD program is. And I believe that study should be undergoing at this point or on its way at this point. So down the road, we may have more information, but at this point, unfortunately, it's too early in the process and we do not have that information. Number 4, kindly give your thoughts on any difference between the PRV for drugs or biologics. And if for biologics, where do we reach out for the application for the PRV? So again, as with question 1, FDA does not have a preference for drugs versus biologics if you're interested in pursuing an application that would be eligible for PRV. And again, we do have Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research for certain products that are regulated by CBER, and then some biologics are also regulated by CDER. So you will need to find out the appropriate review division and reach out to that review division to determine your qualification for such drug products. Number 5, when is the right time to submit a PRV application? After opening of an IND or? So the pearl of wisdom is if you are interested in submitting an application that will qualify for a particular PRV, contact the review division or the appropriate review divisions as soon as possible. That way they can walk you through the requirements for demonstrating whether your product will be eligible for a PRV. And the sooner you start that process, the better off you will be, because then you will understand what you will need to prove or show the FDA in order to be eligible for a PRV. Question 6, is there a specific FDA form or specific format for a PRV application? The current guidance, which was discussed today as well, does not specify the method for application. Also, at what stage of the drug development cycle should the application be done? So for the first part of the question, FDA does not have a specific form to fill out for a PRV application. Basically, what happens is that when you request the FDA to evaluate whether you will be eligible for a PRV, you will need to demonstrate in the application how you will meet all the conditions required for FDA to issue a PRV. That said, for a rare pediatric disease PRV, you can submit a request to the Office of Orphan Product Development to receive a rare pediatric disease designation, and that will be beneficial in terms of the time incentive for a rare pediatric disease PRV. So that's the only exception. The other PRV programs, the tropical disease and medical countermeasures, we do not have a specific form required. And again, the parallelism is always communicate with the the appropriate review division or office that's responsible for your application well in advance, so you know what those requirements are when you submit your application. So that last remark addresses the second part of this question. Question 7, is there flexibility on FDA side on which age range satisfies the pediatric voucher based on the sponsor's actual phase 3 data? For example, maybe it was agreed upon prior to phase 3 that ages 0 to 18 would satisfy PRV, but then after phase 3, it is found that only ages 5 to 18 show clinical effectiveness. So the requirement for rare pediatric disease application is that the disease must affect individuals up to, well, actually 0 to 18 years of age, and FDA interprets that to be anyone below 19 years of age. So if you show that the disease affects individuals ages 5 to 18 years of age, then that will satisfy a portion of the rare pediatric disease requirement. And also the second requirement for a rare pediatric disease is that it must affect the pediatric population less than 19 years of age over 50% in prevalence. So even if there are, a lot of adults who are affected by this disease, as long as you can show that the majority of the patient population affected are pediatrics, then you should be okay. Okay, question 8 for a rare pediatric disease. Should the population go up to the 18th birthday or up to the 19th birthday? And I believe I just addressed that. It will be anyone who is less than 19 years of age. So it could be anywhere up to that 19th birthday. So one day before that 19th birthday. Second part of this question, if RPD sunsets on September 30, 2020, what happens if the application that the RPD is based on is not approved? So if the application is not approved on that sunset date, the sunset provision provides an additional date, September 30, 2022, where the application must be approved by. So you still have additional 2 years after that, after September 30, 2020. So if your application is not approved by September 30, 2022, and there's no reauthorization for the RPD PRV program, then you will no longer be eligible for a pediatric disease PRV. What happens if the voucher is not redeemed? So once the voucher has been issued, there's no expiration on the use of the voucher at this point that I'm aware of. Of course, Congress can always enact some law down the road, but at this point, there's no expiration. Once the voucher is issued, you can use it indefinitely in the future. Question 12, does the original rare disease NDA need to be approved before PRV is issued? And the answer is yes, because the PRV is not effective until the application is approved. And also, certain conditions may change, such as if another application containing the same active ingredient were approved, then you will no longer meet one of those conditions for PRV issuance. And again, I just talked about the sunset provision. If the application is not approved prior to when the program sunset, then FDA may not be able to issue you PRV. I'm going to skip question 13 for now. Question 14, is the PRV fee of $2.4 million in addition to the NDA application fee of $2.4 million? So the response is yes. PRV fees that are due are in addition to any fees that are required under the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. So in this case, if you were to submit an application that requires a full PDUFA fee, then you're looking at about $5 million in total fees. And then number 16, can a sponsor apply for both and be granted both exclusivities under written request and RPD PRV? Roberta? So I'm not sure exactly the nature of the question, but if you're talking about orphan designation and a rare pediatric disease designation, yes, you can submit both designation requests at the same time, but you still need to submit them individually. Right? Okay. And this concludes my portion of the Q&A, unless I receive further questions down the road. My colleague Roberta Szydlo will be here.
Thank you, Peter. So we received a lot of questions, and I'll try to get to as many of them as I can within the remaining time that we have. I received a question about asking me to explain what a major contribution to patient care was, and provide an example if possible. So I didn't spend a lot of time on that in my presentation, but what that means is that when two drugs are of the same drug as defined in the orphan drug regulations, clinical superiority means that the second drug provides a significant therapeutic advantage over and above that provided by the previously approved same drug. And these are looked at on a case-by-case basis. As I said, there's 3 ways that a drug can be considered clinically superior. One was greater effectiveness, another is greater safety in a substantial portion of the target population, and then in unusual cases, I talked about major contribution in patient care when neither greater safety nor effectiveness has been shown. So this is intended to be a narrow category. It's not intended to be a catch-all, and it's used just as I said, by a case-by-case basis, because there's a lot of variables that can come into play. One example that I can provide is of a major contribution to patient care is if there's an approved drug that's administered parenterally, like an IV drug, and then a new same drug for the same use can be given orally. In general, if everything else is equal, the OOPD would consider this to be a major contribution to patient care. I received a question, can an orphan drug grant application be submitted or awarded after a trial has already started? The answer to that is yes. And in fact, if the study is going well, that may actually help improve your score. So the answer again is yes to that. Another question about grants, does an IND need to be active to be eligible for the Natural History Grants Program? So for the Natural History Grants Program, you may not necessarily need an IND. It would depend on how the study is designed. So I would suggest taking a look at the requirements on our website for a natural history study. Someone asked a question about Crestor rosuvastatin tablets that was discussed earlier. And the question is, was orphan designation request submitted before the marketing application? For that example, if I remember correctly, the designation that was requested was for an indication that the drug had not been previously approved to treat. So the designation for that particular indication was submitted prior to the marketing application for that indication. Someone asked about clinical superiority, if it can be demonstrated by using an animal model that's well correlated with human clinical data. Again, major contribution to patient care and clinical superiority are sort of looked at on a case-by-case basis. In general, animal models are usually sufficient for orphan drug designation, but it would really depend on the specifics of what animal model was used and what was found. So without information, I can't give a blanket answer, yes or no to that one. There was a question about, does your indication approved for marketing need to match exactly the orphan drug designation to get the 7 years exclusivity? No, the indication just needs to be within scope of the designation. And as I said during my presentation, the designation is usually for a broad disease, where an indication would typically be narrower than what the designation was. If it's narrower, then yes, you can get the 7 years of orphan exclusivity. This was a good question. We received a question about FDA is switching to eCTD or electronic submissions, and should RPD requests be made on paper as discussed in the guidance, or should it be made in eCTD format? So for RPD disease designation, for that particular step, the OOPD is not yet accepting electronic submissions. So we're working on it, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. So I would recommend taking a look at our website for the specifics on how to submit both for RPD designation requests and for orphan drug designation requests. Unfortunately, those still need to be done hard copy. Someone asked about what specifics can be used to define a population segment for orphan drug designation. And a similar question, you talked about orphan drug designation for a disease that affects more than 200,000 people when there are certain properties of the drug, and can I provide an example? So yes, a drug can receive orphan drug designation if the prevalence of the disease or condition exceeds the limit of 200,000 when evidence is provided that shows that the drug would be either too toxic or it wouldn't work in the remainder of the patients. So as I said, the properties of the drug that we look at would be its toxicity, its mechanism of action, or previous clinical experience with the drug. A good example of this is non-small cell lung cancer. The prevalence of non-small cell lung cancer is over 300,000 in the United States. However, we have designated a number of different drugs for subsets of non-small cell lung cancer. And in those cases, it was because the designation was based on data showing that those particular drugs targeted very specific genetic mutations. And so it was not expected that the drugs would be effective in patients that had other types of, or had non-small cell lung cancer due to other types of genetic mutations. There was another question concerning the grants program. Someone asked if it's sufficient to have an IND for the drug for another use, and do I have to be the sponsor of the IND? The answer to the first question is no. The clinical protocol that's being submitted in the grant application for the product being studied, however, must be submitted to the appropriate FDA review division at least 30 days before the grant application deadline. And the second question, do I have to be the sponsor of the IND? The answer is no, you don't have to be the sponsor, which is probably surprising, but you would, if you're not the sponsor of the IND, then you would need to provide a formal documentation like a collaboration agreement within the application to explain that relationship. And I think that's all we have time for.